Nozomi had signed the lease 3 weeks ago, corresponded entirely through a subletting app, and never once thought to ask for a photo of the person she'd be splitting rent with. Unit 4B. That's all the listing had ever told her. A decent kitchen, natural light, a roommate described only as quiet, works late, keeps to himself. It had seemed like exactly what she needed after the breakup. Someone quiet, someone who kept to himself, someone who wouldn't ask questions she didn't have answers to yet. She pushed the door open with her hip, arms still full, ready to introduce herself to a stranger for the very first time. "Hi, she started, stepping fully into the apartment as the man in the kitchen turned around to greet her. The word died in her throat, because standing in the kitchen of her brand new apartment, holding a coffee mug she recognized instantly, was Kaito. The same Kaito she had once planned an entire life with. The same Kaito she had, 6 years earlier, packed a bag to leave. And neither of them said a single word for a very long time. This is the story of the truth she never told him, and the apartment that finally forced her to. 6 years earlier, Nozomi and Kaito had met over a coffee shop mix-up, identical laptop bags accidentally swapped, forcing an awkward, laughing exchange that neither of them expected to turn into anything more than a funny story. It became something more within weeks. Kaito was steady in a way Nozomi found instantly grounding, the kind of person who remembered small details, who showed up exactly when he said he would, who made her feel, for the first time in her young adult life, like she didn't have to brace herself for disappointment. He had a habit, back then, of noticing things she mentioned only once, in passing, and remembering them weeks later in small, quiet ways. A specific tea she'd mentioned liking during a stressed conversation about exams, appearing in the cupboard days later without comment. It was the kind of steady, unglamorous attentiveness that Nozomi, without fully realizing it at the time, had never actually experienced from anyone before him. By their second year together, they'd already moved in together, the way young couples do when they're certain enough to skip the more cautious steps everyone warns them about. Nozomi told herself it felt right. Mostly, it did. Kaito's family adored her almost immediately, and by their third year, dinners at his parents' house had taken on a specific, comfortable weight, the kind of conversation that circled, gently but unmistakably, around future weddings and future grandchildren, delivered with the easy confidence of people who considered the outcome already settled. At a mutual friend's wedding that same year, Nozomi caught the bouquet, and the entire reception erupted into good-natured cheering directed squarely at her and Kaito. Half the room already mentally planning an outfit for their wedding before either of them had even discussed it seriously between themselves. Nozomi remembered laughing along with everyone else that night, and remembered, too, a small, cold flicker of panic she'd quickly pushed down and refused to examine. What Kaito never knew, what Nozomi had never told a single living soul until this exact moment in her life, was that 6 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday night, she had packed a small bag and nearly left him for good. It wasn't that she'd stopped loving him. It was something harder to explain, something she barely had words for even now, a slow, suffocating feeling that had crept in somewhere between the family dinners and the wedding-adjacent conversations, a growing terror that she was being carried toward a future she hadn't actually chosen for herself, just one that had quietly chosen her. She had rehearsed the words a dozen times that week. "I love you, but I think we moved too fast. I need to figure out who I am before I figure out who we are." She had the bag packed. She had her hand on the doorknob. And then Kaito had come home early, glowing, breathless, an acceptance letter clutched in his hand. She had even written the words down on a small notepad, folding it carefully into her jacket pocket in case her nerve failed her mid-sentence, which she suspected, correctly, that it would. 6 years later, she still remembered every single word of that unread speech, could still recite it from memory as easily as her own name, a strange kind of monument to a conversation that had never actually happened. A research fellowship abroad. 2 years, fully funded, the exact opportunity he'd quietly hoped for without ever letting himself believe it would actually happen. He was so happy that night, so genuinely thrilled, that Nozomi found herself quietly sliding the packed bag back into the closet, telling herself the timing simply wasn't right to say what she'd planned to say. She hugged him. She celebrated with him. And somewhere underneath the genuine happiness she felt for his success, a quieter, more complicated relief settled in as well. Because now, she reasoned, the distance would simply do the work she hadn't had the courage to do herself. In the 3 weeks that followed, Nozomi found herself doing something she didn't fully recognize at the time as manipulation, though she would come to see it clearly, years later, quietly, deliberately, allowing small distances to open up between them, agreeing a little too easily with Kaito's own growing sense that maybe the timing really was impossible, letting him arrive at the ending on his own so she'd never have to be the one who said it outright. When they eventually broke up 3 weeks before his departure, both of them framed it, out loud, as a practical decision about distance and timing and 2 young careers heading in different directions. It was true, as far as it went. It just wasn't the whole truth, and Nozomi had let him believe the smaller version of it for 6 entire years. Kaito left for his fellowship believing they had simply run out of time, not out of feeling. He carried that belief with him for 2 years abroad, then 3 more building a career when he came back, never once suspecting there had been a different, harder truth sitting quietly behind the practical one Nozomi had given him. Nozomi, for her part, spent the 6 years since learning exactly why she'd frozen at that doorknob all those years ago. She dated. She built a career she was genuinely proud of. But every relationship that started to feel even slightly serious triggered the same old suffocating instinct, the same quiet urge to pack a bag before anyone else could notice she'd already begun pulling away. Kaito's own 6 years followed a considerably steadier, though not entirely uncomplicated, path. He threw himself fully into the fellowship, genuinely thriving in the work, building a reputation in his field that eventually brought him back home to a position considerably better than the one he'd left behind. He dated occasionally too, in a measured, careful way of someone who'd built a very tidy explanation for his one significant heartbreak and preferred not to examine it too closely. More than one friend, over those 6 years, had gently pointed out that none of his relationships since Nozomi seemed to last much past the 6-month mark, always ending for reasons that sounded, on paper, perfectly reasonable: different priorities, bad timing, incompatible schedules. Kaito had waved off the pattern each time, telling himself, much like Nozomi told herself, that he simply hadn't met the right person yet, never once suspecting he might be measuring every subsequent relationship against an incomplete story he'd been carrying as the whole truth for years. Her most recent relationship had ended just 6 weeks earlier, in almost the exact same way, not with betrayal or dramatic conflict, but with her own quiet, familiar retreat the moment things began to feel permanent. Her ex, kind and reasonable to the very end, had simply asked her one devastating question before she left: "Do you actually want a life with someone, Nozomi? Or do you just want to keep almost having one?" Looking back over the 6 years since Kaito, Nozomi could count exactly 3 relationships that had followed the identical shape: steady, hopeful beginnings, a comfortable middle stretch, and then, right around the point where meeting family or discussing a shared future became unavoidable, the same quiet, familiar retreat. She had never connected the pattern to that one unfinished conversation in the closet. She had simply told herself, each time, that she hadn't yet met the right person. She hadn't had an answer for him. She still didn't, 6 weeks later, scrambling to find a new apartment on short notice, drawn to a listing that promised exactly the kind of quiet, low-commitment arrangement she told herself was all she currently wanted. A roommate she'd never have to get emotionally invested in, described only as quiet, works late, keeps to himself. That morning, loading the last of her boxes into a rented van, Nozomi had genuinely believed this apartment represented exactly the fresh, uncomplicated start she needed. New city district, new roommate, absolutely no history attached to any part of it. Kaito, for his part, had spent that same morning making coffee and tidying the shared spaces, mildly curious but entirely unbothered about the new roommate arriving that afternoon. Someone named only Ensato on the lease paperwork, a name common enough that it hadn't triggered a single memory. Which made the moment the door finally opened, and 2 people who had built an entire imaginary future together 6 years earlier found themselves staring at one another across a half-unpacked living room, land with an entirely different kind of force than either of them could have braced for. "You're..." Kaito finally managed, setting the coffee mug down with visibly unsteady hands. You signed the lease as N. Sato. Nozomi Sato, she said quietly. I didn't think. The listing never had a photo. I never imagined. She stopped, because there wasn't actually a version of that sentence that made any sense to finish. The leasing agent, who had followed Nozomi up the stairs with the final paperwork, stood frozen in the doorway watching two clearly not strangers stare at each other, entirely unsure whether she should proceed with the standard move-in walkthrough or quietly back out and pretend she hadn't witnessed any of it. Should I come back later? She finally offered, to no response from either of them. Eventually, wordlessly, they both knelt down to gather the scattered contents of the dropped box, a strange, small act of practical cooperation that neither of them commented on, but that somehow, quietly, established the first fragile terms of whatever this new arrangement was going to become. That first evening was, by any reasonable measure, excruciating. They sat at opposite ends of the small kitchen table, picking at a delivery dinner neither of them had much appetite for, exchanging the kind of careful, surface-level small talk usually reserved for actual strangers rather than two people who had once known each other's families, fears, and futures in intimate detail. Neither of them slept particularly well that first night. Nozomi lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of Kaito moving through an apartment they now shared, the specific creak of floorboards she remembered from an apartment 6 years and one entire life ago. The next morning, Nozomi called her closest friend, half convinced she needed to break the lease immediately regardless of the financial penalty. Her friend, unhelpfully but not incorrectly, pointed out that moving apartments twice in 6 weeks was considerably more exhausting than simply surviving a few awkward months with an ex-boyfriend turned roommate. Besides, her friend added, isn't this exactly the kind of thing you'd usually run from? Maybe try not running, for once. Kaito had a nearly identical conversation with his own closest friend that same week, who pointed out, with the blunt honesty only old friends allow themselves, that 6 years was a long time to still visibly react the way Kaito had reacted the moment that door opened. You dropped your coffee mug, his friend said. You don't do that over someone you're actually over. By the end of the first week, they'd drawn up an almost comically formal set of house rules on a whiteboard stuck to the refrigerator, designated shelves, a shared cleaning schedule, clearly marked boundaries around each other's rooms, the kind of rigid structure two people build specifically when they're both quietly terrified of how easily the old familiarity might come rushing back if they let their guard down even slightly. Despite the whiteboard's best efforts, small cracks in the careful formality kept appearing anyway. A late-night run-in in the hallway, both of them in pajamas reaching for the same glass of water, ended not in the stiff politeness they'd been rehearsing but in an easy, genuine exchange of good night that neither of them examined too closely afterward, though both privately noted how natural it had felt. Despite the initial awkwardness, or perhaps because neither of them could quite bring themselves to break the lease over pride alone, the following weeks settled into a strange, cautious rhythm. They developed an unspoken choreography around the shared kitchen, Kaito always leaving the good mug for her, Nozomi always making enough coffee for two without ever being asked to. Small moments of genuine ease kept sneaking through the careful distance they'd both been maintaining. A delivery order mix-up that had them both laughing, really laughing, for the first time since the door had opened on that first devastating afternoon. A shared complaint about their upstairs neighbor's inexplicable 2 a.m. furniture rearranging habit that somehow became a running joke between them within the first month. Nozomi found herself noticing the small, unchanged details of him with an ache she hadn't expected. The way he still left cabinet doors slightly ajar, the same tuneless humming while the coffee brewed, the specific, familiar warmth of a person she'd once known so completely that his habits had become background noise she'd stopped consciously registering at all. Kaito noticed things too, the new, guarded caution in how she talked about relationships now, so different from the openly hopeful 22-year-old he remembered, and a familiar restlessness underneath it that he couldn't quite place, not yet, though something in him recognized it as a version of a feeling he'd once seen cross her face on an ordinary Tuesday evening years earlier, a feeling he'd never understood at the time. One particularly rainy Sunday, neither of them had anywhere else to be, and what started as an accidental overlap in the living room slowly turned into an entire afternoon spent together on the couch, a mindless movie playing in the background neither of them was actually watching. both of them far more absorbed in a conversation that wandered easily from old memories to new opinions neither had heard from the other before. Nozomi caught herself, somewhere around hour 3, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she wanted to admit, simply comfortable, without the usual undercurrent of needing an exit plan. Grocery trips, oddly, became one of the more telling moments of that early period. The two of them naturally falling into an easy division of labor neither had consciously planned, Kaito always grabbing the vegetables while Nozomi handled the dairy aisle, an unspoken choreography that felt disorientingly familiar, like slipping back into a rhythm neither of them had actually forgotten, despite 6 years and considerable effort spent trying to. More than once, Nozomi caught herself smiling at something entirely ordinary, the specific way he stacked dishes to dry, an old habit she'd forgotten she'd once found endearing, and quickly rearranged her expression before he could notice, unsure what to do with a feeling she'd spent 6 years actively avoiding. 2 months into the arrangement, on a quiet evening they'd both wandered onto the small apartment balcony with mugs of tea. Kaito finally asked the question he'd apparently been sitting with since the day the lease papers confirmed her full name. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if it's too much," he said carefully. "The night I got the fellowship letter, you seemed happy for me, genuinely happy. But there was something else underneath it too. I never asked at the time. I think some part of me was scared of the answer." Nozomi felt her chest tighten with the specific dread of a truth she'd carried alone for 6 entire years, one she'd never once said out loud to anyone, not even the friends who'd helped her survive every relationship since. "I had a bag packed that night," she said quietly, her voice barely steady, "before you walked in with the letter. I was going to leave you. Not because of anything you did. You were never the problem. I just felt like I was drowning in a future I hadn't actually chosen, and I didn't know how to say that out loud without hurting you." Kaito sat with that for a long, quiet moment, the kind of silence that stretched long enough for Nozomi to brace herself for anger, for hurt, for the accusation she felt she fully deserved. "So the distance," he finally said. "That wasn't really why we broke up at all, was it?" "No," she admitted. "The distance was just an easier reason to give you. I let you believe it because the actual truth felt too cruel to say to someone who'd just gotten the best news of his life. And then I never found the right moment to correct it. 6 years went by, and it just became the story we both told, even though only one of us knew it wasn't the real one." Kaito was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights, quietly reassembling 6 years of his own life around a truth he hadn't seen coming. "I spent a long time thinking I just wasn't enough reason to stay," he finally said. "Not the timing. Not the distance. Just not enough." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "You were never the reason," Nozomi said firmly, gripping his hand. "You were never once the problem, Kaito. I was terrified of my own life, and I let you carry the blame for something that was entirely mine to own. I am so sorry it took 6 years and an accidental apartment lease for me to actually say that to you." Kaito found himself replaying that night in his memory with entirely new eyes. The specific quality of her hug when he'd burst through the door with the letter, the small catch in her voice he'd noticed at the time and quickly dismissed as excitement on his behalf. 6 years of a story rearranging itself around a single missing piece of information felt, he admitted quietly, disorienting in a way he hadn't expected. Kaito was quiet for a moment longer, processing, before something almost like a wry, exhausted laugh escaped him. 6 years, he said, shaking his head slowly. "I built an entire story in my head about not being enough, and the whole time you were carrying a completely different story alone. We really are both idiots, aren't we?" Nozomi laughed too, despite the tears still on her face, something in her chest loosening for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Spectacular idiots," she agreed. They sat together in silence for a long while after that, not the strained, careful silence of the past 2 months, but something considerably softer. Two people who had just set down a weight they'd each been carrying alone for 6 years, discovering, almost with surprise, how much lighter the air felt once it was finally shared. That night, alone in her room, Nozomi found herself finally examining the pattern she'd spent 6 years refusing to look at directly. Every relationship since Kaito that had ended the exact same way, the same suffocating instinct arriving right on schedule the moment things began to feel genuinely permanent. She remembered, with uncomfortable clarity, the exact moments in each relationship since Kaito when the familiar suffocating feeling had first appeared. A boyfriend suggesting they get a dog together, another mentioning meeting his parents, a third simply saying, gently, that he loved her. Each time, the words had landed not as comfort but as a kind of quiet alarm, a signal that the walls were closing in, that it was time, once again, to begin the slow, careful process of leaving before anyone noticed she already had one foot out the door. She thought of her most recent ex's final question, the one she still hadn't answered. Do you actually want a life with someone, or do you just want to keep almost having one? She realized, sitting alone in an apartment she'd chosen specifically to avoid emotional investment, that she'd built an entire adult life around the same pack bag she'd never actually used with Kaito, always ready to leave before anyone got close enough to really see her. The apartment mix-up, she realized with a slow, uncomfortable clarity, hadn't actually created this crisis at all. It had simply removed the last convenient place left to hide from it. She found an old journal buried in one of her still unpacked boxes and, for the first time in years, actually wrote something in it instead of simply carrying it from apartment to apartment as an unused prop of good intentions. I think I've spent 6 years punishing myself for a conversation I never had the courage to finish, she wrote. And I think the punishment has looked like running from every good thing since, so that I'd never again have to be the one who almost left. She read the words back twice, startled by how simple they sounded once actually written down, after 6 years of carrying them as something far too complicated to ever properly name. She called her closest friend again the next morning, and this time the conversation was entirely different from the panicked 1 week earlier. I think I finally figured out why I keep doing the same thing, Nozomi admitted. Her friend was quiet for a moment before answering, gently. I've known for years, Nozomi. I was just waiting for you to be ready to say it yourself. Some things, you can't hear from someone else. You have to arrive at them on your own. The next morning, Nozomi found Kaito in the kitchen exactly where she knew he'd be, and said the things she'd been building the courage to say since the balcony conversation the night before. I don't want to keep almost having things, she said. With you, or with anyone. I've spent 6 years running from exactly this feeling, and I'm so tired of running. Kaito didn't respond immediately, and Nozomi found she was grateful for the pause. It meant he was actually considering what she'd said rather than simply reacting to it. I'm not going to pretend 6 years and a genuinely complicated history disappear because of one honest conversation, he finally said. But I also don't think either of us ended up in this exact apartment, on this exact lease, entirely by accident. What are you saying? Nozomi asked, something cautiously hopeful breaking through her voice for the first time in months. I'm saying, Kaito said carefully, that I'd like to actually get to know the person you are now. Not the 22-year-old who couldn't say what she needed, and not some idealized memory of her either. Just you, now, honestly, if you're willing to try that. I'd like that, she said. I'd like to actually try, instead of just almost trying. Kaito smiled, the same familiar warmth she remembered from 6 years earlier, now layered with something steadier, more deliberate. Then maybe we start with something small, he said. Dinner. An actual date this time. No lease paperwork involved. Getting ready that evening, Nozomi caught herself feeling something she hadn't expected. Genuine, uncomplicated nervousness, the kind she associated with actually wanting something to go well, rather than the familiar bracing she usually did before a first date, already half planning her exit before the appetizer arrived. Kaito, in a small gesture that made her laugh out loud when she opened her own bedroom door to find him standing there, had brought flowers, knocking formally on a door 15 feet from his own room as though picking her up from somewhere else entirely. It felt important to actually do this part properly, he explained, slightly sheepish, even if the commute was unusually short. Over dinner that night, at a small restaurant neither of them had chosen for practical reasons but simply because they'd both once mentioned liking the look of it in passing, Nozomi found herself talking more openly than she had on a first date in 6 years. Not performing the version of herself she thought a partner might want, but simply being present, honestly, with someone who already knew both the best and most difficult parts of her story. Several months later, the apartment that had started as an accidental collision had slowly, deliberately, become something else entirely. They were still official roommates on paper, though neither of them had bothered updating the lease to reflect what had quietly become obvious to everyone who visited. When Nozomi finally met Kaito's parents again, at a small dinner neither of them had rushed into planning, she found herself genuinely present in a way she hadn't managed 6 years earlier, not bracing against a future being decided for her, but actually choosing, deliberately and out loud, to be there. Kaito's mother pulled her aside briefly in the kitchen that evening, the same warm, familiar woman Nozomi remembered from 6 years earlier, though considerably more careful this time in what she said out loud about the future. "Take whatever time you both need," she said simply, squeezing Nozomi's hand. "We are not in any hurry this time. We just want you both to be sure, for real, whenever that happens to be." "Do you ever think about it?" Kaito asked one evening, back on the same balcony. "How differently this all could have gone if that listing had included a photo." Nozomi laughed, leaning into his shoulder. "I try not to," she admitted. "I think some part of me still can't believe I almost ran from the one apartment that finally made me stop running." Kaito wrapped an arm around her, watching the sunset stretch across the city they'd once left separately and now, finally, shared on purpose. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm glad you never got that photo." Later that night, Nozomi finally showed him the old notepad she'd kept folded in a drawer for 6 years, the unspoken speech still legible in her younger, shakier handwriting. Kaito read it slowly, quietly, and when he finished, he didn't say anything critical or hurt. He simply refolded it carefully and handed it back to her. "Keep it," he said. "Not as something to be ashamed of, just as proof of how far you've actually come since you wrote it." Nozomi placed the old notepad in a small keepsake box that evening, right beside a spare set of keys to the apartment that had, against every reasonable expectation, brought her back to exactly where she'd once been too afraid to stay. If you've ever run from something good because it started to feel permanent, let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Echoes of Us Anime. We bring you a new story just like this every single week.